Rich CEO laughed at the accent, thought it was a punchline. But when the contract hit the table, the joke flipped. That multi-million-dollar deal, signed in front of every smirk, the boardroom never recovered. Respect isn't spoken in accents, it's printed in zeros. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun hadn't yet touched the high glass of Midtown when the double doors of the Zenith Conference Center swung open. Inside, the scent of cologne, leather portfolios, and high-level arrogance floated in the air, like a stale perfume. One by one, the suits gathered, faces tight, teeth whiter than the marble floors, and voices lined with inherited confidence. They came from Harvard, from Wharton, from family offices with names older than jazz. And then came him. Shaquille O'Neal stepped into that boardroom like a thundercloud walking into a wine tasting. He wore a tailored navy suit that couldn't hide the size of the man inside it. Polished shoes, pocket square, no entourage, just Shaq. But none of that mattered the moment he opened his mouth to greet the receptionist. "Appreciate you," he said with a low nod, his southern drawl soaked in Georgia roots. Heads turned, not at his height. They were used to the famous, but at the way he sounded. At the way he dared to sound. The room, full of precision-spoken power players, froze mid-handshake, mid-sip. A young exec with slicked hair whispered, not so quietly, "He from a swamp or a locker room." Someone else chuckled, "Heard they let public school alumni in now." Shaq didn't flinch. He just walked through the hallway like he belonged. Because he did. He had earned his chair at this table. But that's not what they saw. They saw a black man with a booming voice and southern twang, carrying more humility than they could price. Lawson Creed, the CEO of Creed Core Capital, stood at the head of the room, expensive suit, fake smile, all shark. When Shaq entered, Creed leaned to his assistant and said with a grin, "Didn't know BUT was filming today." Laughter. Controlled. Clean. Boardroom acceptable racism. Shaq caught it. He always did. And just like every time before, he let it pass on the surface. He found his nameplate, oversized because they assumed he'd be a joke, and took a seat. The seat was intentionally off-center, placed just barely out of the circle. Subtle, strategic, loud. The moderator, a sharp-talking East Coast private equity man, with a crisp voice and a tighter spine, began introductions. He moved quickly through the list. Banks, investors, politicians, tech founders. Shaq's name came last. Shaquille O'Neal. Independent investor. Real estate and entertainment. That pause before the word entertainment was loaded. It said he doesn't belong. It said he's just a face. It said we're doing him a favor. Shaq smiled, eyes still. He leaned into his mic, cleared his throat gently, and said, "Thank y'all. Happy to be here. Real estate's been my passion for a while now. Lot of people know me from the game, but I've been building on dirt long before I hit hardwood." There it was again. The voice. It was rich, warm, authentic, and to them, utterly unacceptable. Creed tapped his Montblanc pen against his portfolio and said, "I'll try to translate for the table." Laughter. Again. But this time, it wasn't as loud. Because the moment Shaq opened his briefcase and pulled out a portfolio of documents, site development plans, zoning revisions, renewable energy projections, the mood shifted. These weren't vanity documents. These were blueprints, the kind of documents that made investors lean forward. But Creed? He couldn't resist. He slid forward in his chair, his tone buttered and bitter. "Shaquille, do you actually manage these projects or just slap your name on the signage for marketing?" The tone in the room changed. A few heads turned. A few even frowned. Shaq sat still. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend. He didn't educate. He just said, "I walk every block I buy." Creed raised his eyebrows. "Do you walk them with security or a translator?" This wasn't just condescension. It was supremacy dressed in sarcasm. It wasn't new to Shaq, but it was loud this time. Loud enough for others to squirm. A woman from one of the venture firms, Veronica Lane, glanced at Shaq and then at Creed. She didn't laugh. She was uncomfortable now. This wasn't good optics, but she said nothing. Nobody did. Shaq closed his portfolio quietly, not in retreat, but in message. The conversation moved on to valuations, urban development zones, renewable contracts. Every time Shaq offered insight, there was a pause. Someone would repeat what he said, but rephrased, more sterile, more ivy-coated. Then they'd nod in agreement, pretending the idea had just come from someone with the right vowels in their last name. Still, he stayed composed. Not because he was used to it, because he was watching. Every slight, every fake smile, every clipped chuckle at his expense. He watched it all and tucked it away like receipts. When the session broke for catered lunch, he stood beside the coffee bar while Creed leaned in near him and said low, "No hard feelings, big man. You're entertaining, got that folksy charm, you're good TV, just not sure you're boardroom material." Shaq looked at him. Not up, not down, just looked. And said, "I ain't TV. I'm the power grid you didn't read the fine print on." Creed blinked, confused, smirking. Shaq walked away, plate untouched. Later that evening, when the sun dipped and the lights glowed over the skyline, Shaq didn't head to dinner with the others. He walked the blocks near the train yard. The same ones nobody at that summit would drive through without locking their doors. He walked past Ms. Odessa's old house, past Booker's barber shop, past the boarded church that still had gospel flyers from 2006 stapled to the wood. He owned them now. Every parcel, quietly, legally, fully, and under those lots ran something bigger than oil or gas. Untapped geothermal veins, recently surveyed, worth hundreds of millions. A future power source no one in that boardroom had even considered, because they didn't look there. They didn't see value where blackness lived. They never did. But Shaq saw it. He'd been laughed at before. For how he looked. For how he talked. But this time they'd hear him. And not just in words, but in numbers. In deals. In signatures. In silence. Didn't know Walmart had guest speakers, he said, nodding toward Shaq without looking at him. The timing was intentional. Just as the moderator asked Shaq to present his position, the room paused for a breath. One guy coughed to cover a smirk. Another rubbed his temple, knowing this was bad optics but not bad enough to speak up. Shaq stared straight ahead, said nothing. The silence wasn't weakness. It was pressure, the kind that builds before metal bends. He stood, calmly, and began his presentation. His voice, that same voice they'd just mocked, poured out into the space like slow thunder rolling across steel bridges. He spoke with precision, heart, and stats. He presented zoning maps, capital flow reports, green energy grids. The numbers landed with weight. But no matter how clean the data, he could still feel the weight of their eyes, not hearing his words, just measuring his voice. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his tone. But something in his stare told the room, that joke didn't land, and you'll pay for the silence that followed. Creed leaned forward as if to challenge. Interesting numbers, Shaquille. But what's the long-term viability of a project rooted in nostalgia? I mean, investing in rundown districts because of emotional ties doesn't seem sustainable. There it was again, that same tone from 12 years ago, professionalism laced with patronization, the unspoken belief that black emotion was weakness, that black community investment was sentimental instead of strategic. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Where you see nostalgia, I see leverage," he replied slowly. "These communities, they were left for dead. Now they sit on top of untapped infrastructure. That's not memory, Lawson, that's money." Creed smirked again. "You mean geothermal? Cute theory. But that tech's still 15 years from scale." Shaq stepped closer to the monitor behind him and tapped a report. "This is a signed letter of intent from TerraVolt Systems. They've committed $40 million to fast-track geothermal integration across the blocks we already own. Scaling starts Q3. A beat passed. Someone exhaled quietly through their nose. Another reached for a water bottle just to break the tension. Creed's grin faded slightly. His jaw moved once. No words. Shaq sat back down. But inside, memories still rolled like film behind his eyes. The teacher who told him to stop using slang in 3rd grade when he read a Langston Hughes poem. The sports announcer who called him a physical specimen, not a thinker. The college recruiter who asked, "Do you have handlers, or do you manage yourself?" White teeth. Black skin. That had always been the contrast that defined how rooms reacted to him. He learned early on that brilliance in black skin was often mistaken for luck, or dismissed entirely if it didn't come in a suit and tie accent. He never forgot how many times they had confused articulation with assimilation, but he had never wanted to become them. He wanted to beat them, and still be himself when it was over. The boardroom moved on, But Creed kept shooting glances his way, like he was trying to find the flaw, the hole, the fraud, but there wasn't one. Not in Shaq's research, not in his vision, not in his resolve. After the meeting, Shaq took the elevator down alone. One of the junior analysts, mid-20s, black, quiet during the whole session, stepped in after him. They nodded to each other. Silence for a floor. Then the analyst looked over and said, "They don't get it, do they?" Shaq smiled faintly. "They will." The elevator dinged. Shaq stepped out. Across the lobby, Lawson Creed stood in conversation with another exec, laughing again. His laughter sounded thinner now, not amused, but uncertain. The kind of laughter that covered confusion, because this time, Shaq hadn't given him the satisfaction of reacting. He'd given him numbers. Land, leverage, a storm under the surface. And Creed? He had white teeth. But Shaq had black skin, and every memory, every insult, every underestimation had become the foundation of something massive, something coming. South Atlanta didn't ask for headlines. It had long since learned how to live without them. The neighborhoods here bore the marks of time. Cracked sidewalks, boarded storefronts, street signs rusted like the stories they held. There were places where the city's gaze didn't reach, where developers glanced once and crossed the street twice. To them it was urban rot, a polite phrase that meant forgotten, devalued, abandoned by banks, by policy, by design. But Shaquille O'Neal? He never forgot those blocks. 6 years before anyone laughed at his accent in a Manhattan boardroom, he'd walked through these streets in silence. No camera crews, no announcements, just memory guiding him like a map. Every alleyway, every stoop, every mural peeling off brick walls told him something. He'd grown up just a few miles west, but the pain in these corners was the same. The neglect wasn't new. It was generational, systemic, thick in the air, like heat in July. He started buying, quietly, deliberately. One property here, another there. Rundown duplexes, fenced-off lots, abandoned churches with vines crawling up the cross. People didn't ask questions. They saw a familiar face, a known name, and assumed it was charity or sentiment. Some thought he was opening gyms. Others thought he was just tired of basketball and trying to play landlord. But Shaq wasn't collecting homes. He was assembling control. Beneath the surface of those lots ran something no one had paid attention to in decades. Heat. Not the kind from the sun or from engines revving in the streets, but geothermal activity. Shaq had been tipped off by a geotechnical engineer who once trained in Iceland and took a personal interest in undersurveyed American soil. The reports were preliminary, but promising. He paid for deeper scans, environmental reports, resource viability studies. What came back made his hands tremble. If tapped, the land under South Atlanta could provide one of the most efficient, eco-stable geothermal grids in the Southeast. But no one else knew. He moved faster, used LLCs under different names, kept public paperwork vague. He didn't even tell his mother, Lucille, the full extent of what he was doing, only that it mattered. Then came the partners. A startup based out of Denver called Volt Source Labs had just closed a Series C round and was looking to launch their first urban geothermal conversion pilot. Shaq brought them the land, the zoning path, and the community. They brought the technology. They inked a private pre-deal worth more than most real estate developers would touch in their lifetime. It was no longer just land. It was legacy, leveraged. But none of it made the papers. Not yet. Creed Corps, meanwhile, had turned its eyes toward Atlanta. Their model was the same one they'd used in Detroit, Milwaukee, parts of New Orleans. Move into distressed areas under the veil of revitalization. Use holding companies to buy low. Flip, evict, rezone, rebrand, profit. They called it ethical development. Locals called it eviction in a tuxedo. Creed Corps had been late to the Atlanta play because they were chasing a bigger fish in Texas. But now that state politics were shifting, and green incentives were gaining traction, Atlanta had become attractive again, especially the areas they assumed were ripe for flipping. Their analyst flagged South Atlanta as low-cost, high-potential territory. They didn't realize someone already owned half the grid. They didn't realize the man they laughed at across the table in Manhattan controlled the most valuable dirt under their radar. They didn't realize Shaq wasn't reacting to their arrogance. He was waiting for their bid. The power shift wasn't loud. It didn't come with press releases or ribbon cuttings. It came with paper, title deeds, signatures, contracts written in precise, patient ink. Shaq walked those blocks weekly. Not as an investor, but as a neighbor. He sat with Ms. Odessa on her porch, as she told stories about the barber shop that used to sit across the street. He nodded when Mr. Clarence talked about the time the city promised a park and delivered a dump. He listened, not because he had to, but because it reminded him who the land belonged to long before paperwork existed. Still, even as his plan moved forward, the pushback began. Creed Corps sent agents dressed in smiles and khakis to begin soft inquisition. They talked to neighbors, asked about sale prices, floated offers, told people Shaq's group might not know how to close, offered bonuses for silence. The residents pushed back, some because they knew, most because they felt something wasn't right. That's when Creed Corps turned to city contacts. A few quiet donations to campaigns, a lunch with a zoning official, a backroom whisper about eminent domain. They thought they were playing the game. They didn't know Shaq had already rewritten the rules. Zoning permits were in progress for energy use. Community benefit contracts had been drafted. The pilot program with VoltSource was in pre-launch phase. Creed Corps was 2 years behind, and too arrogant to notice. Shaq, meanwhile, was preparing the next move, a public press conference tied to the Clean Energy Partnership. But not yet. Timing was everything. They needed to step on the land first. They needed to make a mistake bold enough to wake the city. They needed to disrespect someone too important to ignore. It came when Creed Corps' local rep, Camden Rise, showed up at Ms. Odessa Bell's home, with paperwork in a clause buried in legal jargon that would have signed over her lot and 5 others around it for less than 30% of market value. Shaq got the call an hour later. She wasn't crying. She was furious. "You tell them boys this is still our street," she said. "I don't care what college they came from." He told her gently, "They're not gonna get it, Auntie D." That night, Shaq walked the block under moonlight. No cameras, no press. He stood outside the chain-link fence around an old warehouse he now owned. Once it had been a clothing factory. Now it would be the operations hub for the geothermal conversion, powered by community-trained workers, not outsourced contractors. The renderings were already drawn. The city would see them soon enough. As he stared at the stars, a phrase drifted back into his mind. Something Creed had said back in that glass box of a boardroom. Didn't know Walmart had guest speakers. Shaq smiled slowly. "They laughed at how I said street," he whispered to the night. "But I own the whole damn block." The letter said her house. The same house she'd inherited from her mother. The house that had survived 2 recessions and a fire, was non-conforming to redevelopment standards. And that a zoning petition was being prepared to fast-track environmental renovation permits. She read those words 5 times and still didn't know what they meant. All she knew was that they were preparing to take something that wasn't for sale. That's when she called Shaq. He answered on the second ring. There was no hesitation in his voice. No confusion. Just a quiet, "I'll be there this afternoon." When Shaq pulled up, he wasn't in a Bentley or behind tinted windows. He was in an old navy blue pickup he'd kept from his first big contract. He stepped out slow, head low, eyes scanning, not paranoid, just practiced. He'd seen moves like this before. The paperwork, the manipulation, the way corporations built legal walls around people until their homes vanished from beneath them. Odessa met him at the porch, and before a word passed between them, she handed him the letter. He read it there, standing on the steps with his massive hands dwarfing the paper. His brow furrowed, not in confusion, but in controlled fury. He read every word twice, then looked up and asked softly, "They come to your door again?" She nodded. "Week ago. Didn't give no name. Had a notepad and a voice like syrup. Said I'd better start thinking ahead before I get left behind." Shaq exhaled slowly and said nothing. Then he pulled out his phone. He made 3 calls. One to his attorney, one to his media contact, and one to the zoning office. Within the hour, a local camera crew arrived. Freelance, unaffiliated, fast. The kind you called when the mainstream wouldn't touch your story until it had already gone viral. Shaq didn't prep a statement. He just walked back to the porch with Odessa and sat beside her, both of them looking into the camera like 2 generations watching the same nightmare rerun. "This is Miss Odessa Bell," he said plainly. "She's lived here 42 years, paid off her mortgage, kept this block alive when everyone else left. Now some corporation wants to write her out in fine print. And we ain't letting that happen." The clip hit social media by evening. At first it was just community pages and Instagram reposts. Then the algorithm got hungry. By the next morning, it had crossed state lines. Big Shaq defends elderly woman from eviction threat, was the headline. But what really spread was the footage. Shaq shoulder to shoulder with a woman who looked like everybody's grandmother, both of them sitting still like stone, unbothered by power, unmoved by fear. Creedcore didn't respond publicly, but their internal Slack channels lit up like wildfire. Legal teams scrambled. PR departments spun drafts. They hadn't expected the story to flip so fast. They were still prepping zoning paperwork and hadn't even finalized their land strategy. Now they were the face of black displacement, and the optics were rotting by the hour. Back on Reedmore Street, nothing had changed, and everything had. Neighbors came out one by one, folding chairs in hand, sitting near Odessa's porch like it was Sunday again. They shared stories about shady offers, letters with empty logos, and salesmen with teeth too white and shoes too clean. Shaq listened. No cameras now, just community. He pulled out a thick file from his backpack. Annotated maps, property titles, zoning clauses. He laid them out on the porch floor and walked the group through every step. What he owned, what they controlled, what the city couldn't override. He showed them where the geothermal lines were being drawn, where community centers were planned, where kids could walk to schools that hadn't been bought out yet. This wasn't just a stand, it was a strategy, and they were part of it. Creedcore wasn't done though. They adjusted quickly, released a press statement 2 days later. Creedcore respects the dignity of all residents and is committed to ethical development and mutual growth. It was vague, hollow, written like a press release from a company who'd never met the people they were displacing. But the damage had landed. Reporters dug deeper. They found evidence of similar letters sent to other homes. 3 families in neighboring blocks came forward. A pattern emerged, legal documents designed to look official, but carried no weight outside intimidation. Shaq, through his legal team, filed a cease and desist on behalf of Odessa Bell and a petition to investigate predatory zoning practices tied to Creedcore's agents. The city council took notice. One member, a woman named Denise Rollins, who had grown up just 10 minutes from Odessa, demanded a hearing. That hearing would be public, and Creedcore would be forced to answer. Shaq didn't show up at that hearing to grandstand. He sat 3 rows back, silent, watching. Behind him, the room was packed with residents. Black, brown, tired, fed up. Not all of them knew who Shaq was, but they knew the feeling. They knew what it meant to be told your roots were in the way of progress. Creedcore's lawyers danced around language, talked about development pathways, community alignment strategies, miscommunication. But every time they spoke, they looked less like professionals and more like men trying to explain away a broken window while standing inside the house. The council ruled to freeze all zoning applications tied to the Reedmore corridor for 90 days pending further review. That same night, Odessa stood on her porch again, this time with a new letter in her hand from Shaq's development firm. A formal notice of community stewardship, no buyout, no fine print, just a guarantee that her home and those around it would be protected under the city's cultural preservation clause, backed by private funding. She read it aloud to the neighbors with a proud smile. Shaq stood in the yard, arms crossed, gaze steady. They'd tried to erase a woman who had lived through more than any boardroom could comprehend. Instead, they'd turned her into a symbol. And Shaq, he wasn't just a man in the fight anymore. It was the fight. The invitation came wrapped in pleasantries but carried the weight of an ambush. Just a man-to-man conversation. Lawson Creed had written. The kind of email dressed in white space and corporate courtesy, signed with a digital signature that smiled even as it plodded. Shaq read it once, then again, the corners of his mouth barely curling. He knew what this was. Not a negotiation. Not a compromise. This was a check-in from a man who had started to feel the ground shift beneath his patent leather shoes. The meeting was set at Creedcore's Midtown headquarters, 30 floors above the noise, sterile and insulated. The elevator opened into a reception floor trimmed in glass and chrome, cool-toned light washing over abstract art pieces no one could name. The smell of eucalyptus and polished stone hovered in the air like entitlement. Shaq stepped out of the elevator, in a black denim jacket, a gray button-down open at the collar, and brown boots that had seen more streets than spreadsheets. His presence was thunder in a quiet cathedral. A few junior analysts looked up from their tablets, eyes wide with that mix of curiosity and caution, like watching a bear walk through a hedge fund. The receptionist offered a rehearsed smile. directed him toward the executive suite, and pressed a code on the glass wall that slid open like the door to a vault. Inside sat Creed, not behind his desk, but at a round table designed to look egalitarian. It wasn't. There were only 2 chairs. One had been made deliberately smaller. "Shaquille," Creed said with outstretched arms and an air of false warmth. "Glad you made time." Shaq nodded once. "You asked?" "I'm here." They sat. Water was poured. No offer of coffee. Creed folded his hands, elbows planted, leaning forward like a coach delivering halftime adjustments. His smile flickered in and out of frame. "I'll get to it," Creed began. "The last few weeks have been surprising. The media attention, the zoning freeze, the online narrative. Things escalated faster than I think either of us wanted." Shaq didn't speak. He just watched. "I've always respected your presence," Creed continued. "You've got influence, reach. But this, what happened on Reedmore, it turned into something political, emotional. That wasn't our goal." Shaq leaned back. "Then what was?" Creed laughed lightly, like a man trying to steer turbulence with charm. "Partnership, shared value, community evolution. The usual. But let's be honest, the public doesn't always see nuance." At that, the door opened and a third man walked in. Young, wiry, smug, white suit, blue tie, perfect posture. The kind who wore designer clothes with the confidence of someone who thought struggle was a marketing tactic. "This is Jordan Fair," Creed said. "Our legal strategy director. He's been reviewing the zoning complications." Fair didn't offer a handshake, just a nod. Then, a smirk. "Big fan," he said, sitting across from Shaq. "Always admired your game. Lot of power. Just want to make sure we can simplify the language a bit for the table. You know, bring it down to street level." Shaq didn't blink. Fair continued. "There's a lot of jargon in these contracts. Zoning statutes, conditional clauses. Figured we'd walk you through them step by step, make sure we're all on the same page. No offense." Shaq smiled. "None taken." He pulled out his phone, tapped record and placed it on the table. Creed blinked. Are we recording?" Shaq's voice was even. "For clarity." The room went silent. Creed shifted. Fair chuckled, but it sounded thinner now. Shaq reached into his backpack and removed a leather-bound folder. Inside were certified property ownership records, community agreements, zoning proposals already in city review, and a signed memorandum of understanding with VoltSource Labs. He laid them out on the table slowly, methodically. "These aren't projections. They're facts." Creed looked down, his eyes scanning the papers faster than his confidence could keep up. Fair leaned over, face pinched. "We were under the impression some of those lots weren't fully cleared," Fair said. "You were under the wrong impression," Shaq replied. "And I don't correct impressions. I let 'em play out." Creed finally looked up. "So what now?" Shaq met his gaze. "Now you figure out whether you want to lease power from me, or keep losing trying to take what's already mine." Creed's jaw tightened. Shaq continued. "You laughed at the way I talk, but I speak fluently in land, in leverage, in loyalty. You bought PR. I built trust, and you can't evict that." Fair interjected. "We don't have to make this adversarial." "It's already been adversarial," Shaq said. "You sent people to an old woman's porch with scare tactics and legal bait. You tried to erase her name with a font size 12 contract. I showed up. Now I'm staying." Creed stood pacing once behind his chair, then returning to it slowly. He looked older now, or maybe just exposed. "You came here to make a point," he said. Shaq shook his head. "I came here to watch yours collapse." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was surgical. He stood, gathered his documents, and slid his phone back into his pocket. "I'll let my team reach out," Shaq said. "But just so you're clear, I'm not here for applause. I'm here to build something that outlives your profits." He walked out the same way he walked in, slow, calm, measured, like a man who had seen the lion's den for what it was, velvet-covered fear. The elevator doors closed behind him, and 30 floors down, South Atlanta waited. And upstairs, Creed finally realized he wasn't sitting across from a celebrity. He'd been sitting across from a reckoning. 2 days later, in a nondescript conference room at the Atlanta Civic Resources Building, Shaq walked in with a steel case, his development team behind him, flanked by a representative from VoltRenew. Not just a green tech disruptor, but the fastest-growing geothermal energy company on the East Coast. The room wasn't as flashy as Creedcore's boardroom. No art, No panoramic skyline views. But this room held teeth. Lawyers, land surveyors, policy officers, a city energy official who hadn't blinked when she signed the strategic designation papers. What the press hadn't yet caught was that the city had reclassified several urban areas, previously dismissed as non-essential, into strategic development corridors for future energy infrastructure. It was part of a green incentive program tied to federal funding. Buried in that bill was a list of locations eligible for expedited permits and long-term energy leases. Shaq's land sat right in the heart of that rezone, and he owned every inch. He let his legal lead, Marlon Briggs, do the talking. Briggs was ex-SE, razor-sharp, and fluent in the language. Creed's team thought only they spoke. He presented the documents with minimal flair, land ownership certifications, zoning clearance reports, and most importantly the exclusive licensing agreement between O'Neill Urban Energy and Voltron. The agreement gave Shaq's firm not just development rights, but operational authority for geothermal installation, profit share from federal credits, and first rights on energy distribution deals in the southeastern grid. It was airtight, clean, bulletproof. What Creed and Fair had failed to realize, because they were too busy chuckling over Shaq's southern twang and underestimating his silence, was that this wasn't about optics. This was infrastructure. They thought they were playing Monopoly. Shaq was drafting the deed. 2 hours later, back at Creed Corps' executive suite, the fallout began. Shaq didn't return to their office. He didn't need to. He simply emailed a scanned copy of the notarized licensing agreement, accompanied by a single sentence. Your window just closed. The attachment was time-stamped. Signed, approved, filed with the city. Creed was mid-call with a venture partner when the email pinged his screen. He opened the document, scanned it once, then again. His grip tightened on the phone. He waved off the room, stepped out, and dialed Fair. You see this? He asked, not waiting for a greeting. Fair's voice was already tight. Yeah, I'm reading it now. Tell me it's reversible. It's not, Creed paced. You said he didn't have full parcel control. I said we weren't sure. Well, now we're sure. At that very moment, Shaq was across town at a press luncheon hosted by the Atlanta Sustainability Coalition. Nothing dramatic. No headlines, just a casual drop-in. But when he took the mic to answer a question about urban equity and green jobs, he casually mentioned the energy partnership and the geothermal license secured for the Reedmore block. The reporters perked up. By nightfall, headlines hit the feed. Shaquille O'Neal secures landmark urban energy deal. Billion-dollar corridor in play. Creed Corps loses land control as Shaq flips South Atlanta into clean power hub. The narrative flipped overnight. Creed's firm, once poised to absorb the blocks quietly, now looked foolish, scrambling to reframe, rebrand, repair. Their investors called emergency meetings. One even leaked a transcript from the earlier board session, the one where Fair joked about simplifying the language for Shaq. The clip went viral, paired with a quote from Shaq's speech at the luncheon. They thought I needed help reading the contract. I wrote the damn blueprint. This time, no one was laughing. Creed issued a statement calling the moment a mutual win for community and capital. But the damage had landed. Stockholders were uneasy. One mid-level exec resigned. A petition surfaced demanding internal review into Creed Corps' minority engagement practices. Meanwhile, Shaq didn't spike the football. He sent flowers to Odessa Bell. He hosted a dinner for the homeowners on the block, served from food trucks run by local black chefs. No press, no posts. Just the people who'd been forgotten, finally at the center of something powerful. At the end of the night, someone asked him if he was going to run for office. He laughed. Nah, too many rules. I like writing my own. And somewhere in a private email thread, Creed and Fair sat staring at the very papers they never read, contracts they'd ignored, reports they'd skimmed, parcels they assumed no one wanted. But Shaq had seen the value in dirt, long before they saw the gold underneath it. And he hadn't just won. He'd changed the board. They used to say I talk slow, but I think deep. They move fast, but they fall hard. Shaq's voice wasn't coming from a podium this time. It was voiceover on a slick documentary teaser dropped unannounced by a small independent media outfit that had been following the Reedmore story. The teaser was just 90 seconds long. Aerial shots of South Atlanta, panning over newly painted porches, dug-up soil being repurposed for energy grids, and the silhouettes of black families standing on front lawns. Then it cut to a still shot. Shaq seated on a folding chair outside Odessa Bell's home, elbows on knees, eyes calm, face unreadable. No words on screen. Just that quote. The internet lit up within hours. While tweets and headlines swirled, the real noise was happening behind soundproof glass in Creed Corps' headquarters. The boardroom was full now, not of laughs or clever jabs, but tension. You could smell it. A hollow quiet. Chairs shifted, fingers tapped at tablet screens, and people whispered over data that couldn't be spun anymore. Creed sat at the head of the table, jaw locked, eyes flickering between his assistant and the big screen at the far end, which showed the new valuation projections of the geothermal corridor. The number was no longer a hopeful estimate. It was a hard, glaring figure, $265 million, and that was just the first phase. The assistant, pale and sweating, fumbled with a spreadsheet. "It's confirmed," she said, eyes wide. "The land title filings are clean. O'Neill controls full development rights, and the Voltrenew contract is real. No backdoor in, no counters. We missed it." Creed leaned forward. "What's our exposure?" A man in a checkered blazer, one of the senior investors, answered flatly. "Total loss of anticipated corridor access. We were banking on those parcels to support our second-tier equity leverage. That's 28% of our third-quarter growth strategy." Another board member, this one with the posture of an old general, muttered under his breath. All that time laughing about his voice, didn't think to listen to what he wasn't saying. Creed stood up slowly, adjusted his cuffs and turned toward the window, though there wasn't anything to see through the reflection. "They'll sell eventually," he said, his voice thin. "Everyone sells." But no one responded, because everyone in the room had already seen the list of offers they had pushed across the table over the last 24 hours, and the silence that followed each one. Shaq didn't even counter. He just didn't respond. Not through his lawyers. Not through his team. Not through press. The absence of reply became louder than any rejection. Revenge, they now understood, wasn't always about the slam of a gavel or a triumphant speech in a courtroom. Sometimes it was just the quiet refusal to answer the very people who thought you'd beg to be heard. And the silence, it was thunder. Shaq didn't take interviews. He didn't tweet. He let the media do what it does best, chase the narrative they once ignored. Every channel was running something. Profiles titled "From Ballplayer to Billion-Dollar Disruptor," segments that once scoffed at his community land grabs, now praising his visionary urban strategy. The headlines flipped so fast they gave Creed's PR team whiplash. They drafted a release titled, "Creed Corps commends O'Neill for his investment in the future," a pathetic attempt at reclaiming dignity. But no one bought it. The public had already seen the clip of Shaq sitting in a folding chair with Miss Odessa, both sipping lemonade like royalty on a porch that had become a monument. Back in South Atlanta, there were no banners or balloons, just movement. The first trench was dug for the Voltrenew unit near the old firehouse lot. New fencing went up around a half-acre that would soon house the district's first micro-energy center. Residents who had once dodged potholes now walked past schematics pinned to wooden boards, nodding at each other like they were in on something the world was just waking up to. Shaq walked those blocks with the same slow pace he always had. People greeted him with familiarity, not fanfare. He liked it that way. The camera crews kept trying to catch him there, but he avoided them without trying. He wasn't hiding. He just didn't care to explain anymore. Let them wonder. The mayor's office reached out twice. No reply. A city councilwoman even offered to schedule a ribbon-cutting ceremony in his name. Shaq declined. "This ain't about my name," he told Marlon Briggs. "It's about who gets to stay." Still, the impact rippled far beyond Atlanta. Other neighborhoods took notice. Advocacy groups started looking deeper into land value in historically black communities. What was once called urban decay was now being reframed as untapped sustainability. Not because the land changed, because someone finally refused to give it away. Creed tried one last angle. He called. Shaq didn't answer, so he sent a personal email, not long, just a few lines. An acknowledgement, a veiled compliment, and a vague olive branch. Shaq read it once, then deleted it. The silence was the reply. Because the lesson was already clear. Creed had misread everything. The man, the voice, the intent. He thought slow speech meant slow thought. He thought a quiet room meant a weak strategy. But Shaq hadn't just planned for their resistance. He had counted on it. They couldn't undo what was done. They couldn't outbid history. And now the man they had mocked for his accent, for not speaking their language, had mastered the one they respected most: power without permission. Back on Reedmore Street, as dusk rolled in and porch lights flickered on like fireflies, Shaq stood at the edge of a lot that used to be covered in weeds and broken glass. It was clear now, prepped for framing. He looked over the soil, the steel markers in place, and nodded once. No applause. No speeches. Just the wind brushing through the trees, like a whisper. And in that whisper, if you listened close, you could still hear the echo of a laugh. But it wasn't his. It was theirs. The last one they'd ever have. The audio hit the net like a detonator. It began on activist forums, then filtered to journalist subreddits, then to Twitter, then to the national news. The word ghetto was replayed in clips spliced against footage of Shaq at Odessa Bell's porch, kids playing outside the geothermal lot, and the phrase "they always fold" typed in bold above the words, "Not this time." Sponsors dropped. Fast. A regional bank pulled out of its pending line of credit. 2 consulting partners announced their separation from Creedcore, citing irreconcilable ethics violations. Creedcore's PR team issued a desperate statement. The words captured in that audio do not reflect our values. But the market didn't buy it. By Friday, Creedcore stock had dropped 17%. By Monday, it dropped 31%. And then the lawsuits began. 5 residents from South Atlanta, including Odessa Bell, filed a class action complaint, citing harassment, intentional deception, and illegal property intimidation tactics. Their lawyers were backed by a national coalition that had been waiting to pounce, and now they had their moment. Internal emails leaked next. Spreadsheets with redline edits from middle managers who had flagged ethical concerns and were ignored. One message read, "Are we pushing too hard on these older residents? This feels like bad press waiting to happen." The reply from an exec simply said, "They won't fight. They never do." Screenshots circulated on Instagram, with the hashtag #they fought. Inside Creedcore's headquarters, everything turned glassy and cold. Hallways once filled with casual laughter now echoed with tense footsteps and closed-door meetings. Jordan Fair's office lights stayed off for 2 days. Colin Drayton was suspended pending internal review. But everyone knew it was ceremonial. He'd already been marked. And Shaq? He said nothing. No press release. No interviews. No tweets. He didn't retweet the trending hashtags with his name. Didn't comment on the lawsuits. Didn't go live on Instagram. Like so many expected. He just watched. He let the silence stretch, a mirror held up to every exec who ever tried to bury truth beneath contracts and catchphrases. The irony wasn't lost. The man they once tried to humiliate with mockery was now holding up their own words as their undoing. The documentary teaser played again on national networks. News anchors used words like historic and unprecedented. Analysts on financial shows warned that Creedcore's credibility in emerging corridors was now radioactive. Public trust had evaporated. The board met again in emergency session. Lawson Creed entered, looking 10 pounds lighter, his suit hanging wrong, his eyes heavy. He didn't sit. He just looked around the table at faces no longer loyal, only calculating. "We can survive this," he said quietly. "We restructure, apologize, make a goodwill donation. We ride out the noise." But the board didn't nod. One finally spoke. Shaquille O'Neal didn't ride out the noise. He waited for it to clear, then spoke with deeds, not statements. Another added, "You didn't just lose the land, you lost the narrative. And when a company like ours loses that, we become cautionary." Creed's jaw clenched. "So what, you want my resignation?" Silence again. Then someone slid a single envelope across the table. The letterhead read, "Special vote of no confidence." Creed stared at it for a long time. Somewhere, far below those boardroom floors, South Atlanta's soil remained untouched by their money, their buildings, their boots, and Shaq remained silent. Because when the system collapses under the weight of its own arrogance, the cleanest sound you can make is no sound at all. The diggers rolled in just past dawn, not with noise and banners, but with quiet precision. No golden shovels, no ceremonial ribbon cutting, no podiums blocking sidewalks, just boots crunching soft soil, blueprints unrolled on folding tables, and crews of workers, most of them from within a 5-mile radius, ready to build something that belonged to them. For decades, city planners had drawn red lines through this block, shading it in on maps, under categories like low viability, high crime, and non-essential. It had been called a wasteland, a pocket of poverty, a black hole for investment. Local politicians threw around phrases like urban renewal, but no one ever came. Developers skimmed it, circled it, offered insults disguised as lowball deals, but they never touched it, because Shaq never let them. Now the block that had been forgotten was humming with the energy of something deeper than profit: reclamation. Steel framing rose where a condemned dry cleaner once stood. Next door, a community business incubator began taking shape, with space pre-leased to 4 black-owned startups: a tech repair shop, a vegan cafe, a non-profit youth music studio, and a cooperative print shop. Each one funded not through flashy investors, but through Shaq's silent capital, funneled through a network of trusts built for exactly this. The old warehouse that once leaked when it rained was now being reworked into a clean energy lab. Not a flashy research tower, but a functional space, with solar-paneled roofing and geothermal conduits dug straight into the earth beneath. The name on the building wouldn't be Shaquille O'Neal. It would be the Bell Resource Center, named after the woman who dared Creed Core to show up at her door with papers again. Inside that lab, kids from the neighborhood would soon walk the same halls once meant for industry, but now retrofitted with innovation. Classrooms with 3D printed models of energy grids, hands-on soil stations teaching students how heat moved under their own feet. A wall-length mural painted by local high schoolers showed portraits of elders, teachers, postal workers, bus drivers, pastors. It wasn't about celebrities, it was about the ones who stayed. Shaq stood just beyond the fence, watching it all unfold with his hands in his pockets. No clipboard, no media handler. He'd been offered interviews, national ones, morning shows, financial magazines. He'd said no. He didn't need a cover story. This was the story. Across the street, a kid, no older than 11, pointed through the fence at the trench where techs were wiring geothermal nodes. "That's the heat battery, right?" he asked his cousin. Shaq heard it and smiled. That word battery was new here. Before, all you'd hear were words like broken, dangerous, dirty. Now these kids were using words tied to invention. They were learning futures once kept from them. A city official visited the site later that week, hoping to spin a photo op out of it. But she found no podium, no ribbon, no Shaq waiting with a handshake. Just a construction crew too busy to pause and an operations coordinator, who politely told her, "The community's leading this one. We appreciate the visit though." The city eventually did pass a resolution, recognizing the development as a model of eco-conscious reinvestment. But Shaq never showed to accept the plaque. It was mailed to the Bell Center. The staff pinned it in the back hallway, behind the emergency exit map. What mattered was what you could walk through, what you could breathe in. Affordable housing units were being framed 3 blocks over. Not luxury condos, not developer-run apartments. Homes built under a living legacy model, community land trusts that prevented outside corporations from buying them up in 5 years. Families children could grow here without being priced out. The wait list for those units grew faster than the walls did. But that was okay, because for the first time, the wait didn't feel like a stall. It felt like a promise being kept. Shaq walked the site every Sunday. No entourage. Just a clipboard and his boots. He'd check in with Marlon Briggs on project timelines. But mostly he'd stop by the houses. Not to inspect. To listen. He listened to Ms. Janelle talk about the garden boxes they planned to install behind Unit 3B. He listened to Malik, who ran the after-school coding program, explain how they were building a mobile app to track energy usage from each home. He listened to the quiet, because it had taken him years to realize that silence, when earned, could be peace. One afternoon, a teenage girl approached him near the mural wall. "You really own all this?" she asked, half skeptical. Shaq grinned. "Nah, I just made sure nobody else stole it." She looked at the portrait of her uncle on the mural, and nodded. "He said you used to be loud, on TV." Shaq chuckled. "Still loud. Just in a different way." That night, Shaq met with the project coordinators in the small back room of the cafe in progress. He reviewed budgets, talked phase timelines, approved a request to fund an extra 4 lab kits for the fall class. Then he sat back, letting the team do the talking. They weren't just managers now. They were builders, stakeholders. Some of them had grown up here. Some had returned after decades. All of them had been overlooked once. But not anymore. Creed Core's name hadn't come up in weeks. Their downtown office lights still flickered on, but their footprint in Atlanta was gone, erased by accountability, buried by silence.
That was the difference.
They built with bulldozers. Shaq built with memory. Legacy wasn't a plaque on a wall or a soundbite on a stage. It was a porch light that stayed on. It was kids saying words like infrastructure and equity and not meaning politics, meaning home. And on that block, the one they couldn't touch, the future grew wild and rooted, right where they thought nothing would ever rise again. The podcast wasn't flashy. No $1 million studio. No clout-chasing host. Just a folding table in the back of a bookstore and 2 mics held together with rubber bands. The episode wasn't even supposed to drop that week. The producer had a guest reschedule last minute. So when Shaq said yes, it wasn't booked out of strategy. It was spontaneous. The host, a 30-something woman with sharp wit and a scratchy laugh, leaned in and asked halfway through, "Do you ever think about how it all started? Not the buildings, not the billions. I mean the laugh. That first laugh. Back in that Manhattan boardroom." Shaq paused, looked at the table, then at the mic, then leaned forward slowly. "They judged me off sound," he said. "But I ain't noise. I'm thunder. And thunder don't beg to be heard." That was all he said. No follow-up. No long explanation. Just that. The episode went live late Friday night. By Sunday morning, the clip had hit 6 million views on X, 4 million on TikTok, and found its way into morning talk shows, college lectures and church sermons alike. They played it over B-roll footage of his geothermal energy grid, of children running through the Bell Center, of streets once ignored now filled with color and sound, and something the headlines couldn't quite name. No one could deny it anymore. The voice they once dismissed now echoed in places their own had never reached. That Monday, Shaq stood on the rooftop of the Bell Resource Center, arms folded across his chest, eyes sweeping the horizon. The city shimmered in layers. Skyline on one side, block parties and construction scaffolds on the other. Beneath him hummed the slow churn of the grid, the warmth of earth converted into light, into water, into fuel for homes that had been cold for too long. It wasn't victory he felt. It was continuity. The rooftop wasn't fancy. No champagne, no cameras today, just the breeze and the low thrum of something finally working right. Briggs joined him for a moment, holding a clipboard. "We're at 88% completion," he said. "Press wants to do a walkthrough next week." Shaq shook his head. "Let the numbers walk." Briggs smiled. "They're already running." Shaq stayed a little longer, after Briggs left, watching the horizon shift orange as the sun tipped west. Kids played basketball in the half-court he'd had resurfaced last spring. A teen group from the local school was setting up folding chairs for their poetry night. In the corner, a mother adjusted her daughter's ponytail, while the girl practiced saying her name into a mic. The girl paused, then whispered to her mom, "Do I sound too country?" Shaq heard it. He walked down the fire escape and across the lot, crouching beside her with the slow grace of someone who never wanted to startle. "Where you from?" he asked. "Here," she said. "Then you sound perfect," he said. "Don't change for people who don't listen." She nodded. He nodded back. Back in the day, they used to say his accent was unpolished. Said it lacked the neutral clarity required for business. What they meant was that it reminded them of everything they thought they'd erased. Working-class rhythm, black cadence, southern truth. But now that voice narrated documentaries. It introduced keynote speakers. It inspired city murals, not because it changed, but because it didn't. Across Atlanta, in coffee shops and gyms and barber chairs, people were quoting him. Not stats, not his championships, but his words. "I don't talk fast because I don't rush truth. Loud don't mean angry. It means unafraid." They gave me a mic. I gave him a mirror. Podcasts, speeches, Instagram captions. The sound of Shaq had become something more than voice. It had become a signal, a reminder that history didn't always speak in straight lines or clean vowels. Back in Midtown, the same boardroom where it all began had gone quiet. Creedcore still existed, barely, rebranded, trimmed down. Several executives replaced, some with NDAs, others with exit packages that included dignity clauses. But no one really cared anymore. Investors had moved on. The story had moved on. Shaq never publicly named Creed in any interview. He never dragged anyone, never leaked a single email. He didn't have to. His silence told the story. His patience signed the deal. And his voice, slow, deep, grounded, made history without needing a war cry. The next time he spoke on a panel, it wasn't about real estate or basketball. It was about community autonomy. He told a room full of educators, business leaders, And city developers. You don't change a neighborhood by fixing buildings. You change it by respecting the people who lived there before you showed up. The ones who stayed, the ones who didn't sell, the ones who taught you how to pronounce your own street names. He got a standing ovation. Not because he raised his voice, but because he didn't have to anymore. The building they said would never rise now had a waiting list for tenants, all priced under market. Every business inside the community incubator was owned by a resident within a 10-block radius. The Clean Energy Lab was now partnered with 3 local schools and a university program. Kids wrote essays about the future of heat. Parents no longer feared displacement letters showing up in their mailboxes. Legacy didn't wear a suit. It wore work boots and told stories on stoops. It sang through laughter at block parties and hummed from power lines quietly feeding homes that once went dark every summer when the bills stacked too high. Shaq stood in it, lived in it, moved through it like gravity. And somewhere far from the noise, the headlines, the lawsuits, the spin, a clip kept playing, that podcast moment, over and over again. They judged me off sound, but I ain't noise. I'm thunder, and thunder don't beg to be heard. This time, nobody laughed. You heard the story. Now check the blueprint. Change doesn't come from noise. It comes from ownership. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told to tone it down, this isn't just Shaq's win. It's the start of a new playbook. Watch what happens when the block talks back.